Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I am Nikhil Kumar. In our last video, we have learned how to configure applications using commands, arguments and the environment variables in the Kubernetes. If you haven't checked that out, I will link the link above. Make sure to check it out because today we are going one step further with the config maps. Config maps are one of the most practical ways to manage configuration data in Kubernetes. Instead of baking configs into your image, you can manage them separately and inject them at runtime. So let's jump straight into the demo. And this is our Kubernetes cluster. And this is a 2-node cluster. Let's start simple. Suppose your application needs two values. The environment variable, like it's running in production, and the database URL. We will create a config map directly from the literals. So for that, we can use our command kubectl create config map and the config map name app-config, and here I'm specifying -- from literals. That means we are specifying the values or the configuration values into the command line itself. For that I am going to use the app_env equal to prod. Another configuration is -- from literal and is db_url db_url. And here I am specifying MySQL db-service and the port number. I'm just giving a random value here just to show you how to create a config map. The config map got created. Let's check it using a kubectl get config map. And we can see there is one config map called app-config which got created 9 seconds ago. And if we run it with the -o YAML, this is the complete configuration file for the config map. And here we can see these are the values which we have provided using the CLI. And think of this config map is like a dictionary of config which you can reuse in the pods. In our earlier video on configuring application, we injected environment variable directly in the pod manifest file. Now let's make it cleaner using the config map. So if we see this particular file, that is envpod.yml, here we have injected the value inside the manifest file itself. So I'm going to update it to the config map. So let me clear out the screen and create one manifest file, that is pod cm, that is config map, and the env.yml. And let me create a pod manifest file, and the version is v1 kind pod and metadata. And here I'm specifying the name app env-demo and specification containers name is equal to app-container, and the image is busybox. Here I am specifying the command which we have learned in our previous video. Because I need a shell, so I'm using the sh-c. And here I am specifying the arguments to override some values, and here echo environment is equal to app_env and echo the db_url which we have created in the config map. And I'm adding a sleep for 3600 seconds. And here earlier we used the environment keyword, but instead of env we are going to use a env from. So here we have created a config map. So we are going to use a config map to inject the variables inside this particular pod. So env from and the config map ref. So we are giving a reference of config map we just created. And here I am giving a name of that config map, that is app-config. So let me quickly verify the name. So we can use a CM as well instead of full config map, and app-config is the name. So let me apply this particular manifest file kubectl apply -app pod-cm, and the pod got created. And if we see the logs, kubectl logs, and this is the pod name, we can see environment and the database URL is being printed, and it is being injected by the config map itself. So now instead of hard coding, we are decoupling configuration from the pod manifest file. This is very helpful when you have a dynamic value which is getting changes time to time. So you don't need to update your pod manifest file each and every time. Instead of that, you just need to update config map and your application will get updated automatically. Now some applications don't take config as environment variables. They expect some config files. That's where we can mount config maps as volume. Here we are just providing some environment variables, so we are using the normal from literals. But there are some scenarios where we need to inject some files into the application, like applications of Nginx configuration file or Apache web server or something like that as well, right? So for those scenarios, we can mount our config map as a volumes. So let's first create a config map from a file. Let me create one file. First, let me clear out the screen. So I'm creating one file using the echo command. Welcome to Kubernetes app, and I'm updating content into message.txt file. So content got updated. Now let's create a config map using this file. So for that, kubectl create config map and the app-message, and instead of from literal, we can use a from file, and we can specify the file name. And we can see the config map got created, and let's verify it very quickly. We can see the config map got created with the name app-msg. And if we describe this with the -o YAML, -message -o YAML, we can see this is the file name and this is the content of the file. And if we want to see a different set of options for the config map creation, we can use a kubectl create cm -alp, and here we can see a different set of options for the config map creation, like from environment file, from literal. So we have used from literal to pass some environment variable by the CLI. We just use from file to create a config map using the file. Similarly, we have a different from environment file as well. Now let's create a pod manifest file to define a config map as a volume. So let me create a pod-volume.yml. This is a pod manifest file in which the config map is mounted as a volume. And if you see, this particular block is very different from the previous one, because we have used volume and the volume mounts to mount our config map. So here in the volumes, you can see it defines a volume using the config map. So here we define the volume, that is config-volume, and we are using the config map which we just created, that is app-message. And here if we go above, we can see the volume mounts. It mounts that config map inside the container at the /config directory, and the file msg.txt now lives inside the container without we need to rebuild the image. So let's quickly apply this. kubectl apply -f pod-volume. The pod got created. So let's quickly verify this. The pod is in the running state now. Now let's check the logs for this. kubectl logs and the pod name, and we can see the same content is being printed on the application, because if we cat this particular file, this is the same content we just updated here. This particular content is being injected from the file via the config map. This is very helpful when we are working with the multiple configuration file for different set of application. Rather, we are doing it all those things manually by updating the configuration file in the container. We can use the config maps to do those operations automatically. Now let's take an example. If you're running an Nginx, you can store nginx.conf inside a config map and mount it to the nginx.conf inside the container. This way you don't need to rebuild images each and every time the config changes. You just need to update the config map in those scenarios. So for that, you just need to do one thing, that is kubectl edit config map and the app-config. Oh, there's a typo in that. I think I missed this G. So now we can update this content here. So let me update it to the prod. And just like that, we just update the configuration in the config map. But it does not reflect automatically in the running pod. You usually restart or redeploy the pod to pick up the new configuration. So we just need to do one thing in that scenario. We just need to, what is the name of the manifest file? This is the file name. Yeah, this is the one. So let me delete this -f pod cm. The pod is getting deleted. The pod got deleted. Let's recreate it again. But before that, let me verify this. The pod is not there. So let's apply this kubectl apply -f pod-cm environment.yml, and the pod got created again. And if we check it, the pod is in the running state. And now let's check the logs for this, and let's see does the configuration got updated or not. And we can see the configuration got updated automatically. We just updated the config map and the value got updated. We just need to restart the pod or redeploy the pod. And that's all for today. So we have learned how to create config map, inject them as an environment variable, mount them as a file inside the pods, or use them in the real world application like web server, that is like Nginx or the Apache. If you haven't watched the video on configuring application with command arguments environment, I will suggest you to check it out because it pairs perfectly with this one. If this helped you, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.